You know that feeling when you scroll through a dozen receiver listings, the glossy photos promise cinema-grade sound, but then you get home, hook everything up, and the bass feels thin, the dialogue gets lost, and you wonder if you just paid a premium for a pretty front panel? I've been there, and I've also heard enough it sounded great in the store stories to know that the real test is how a unit lives in a lived-in living room, not how it looks on a spec sheet. That's why I'm breaking down the Sony STRAZ5000ES Premium ES 11.2 Channel A/V receiver before you click Add to Cart. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, the STRAZ5000ES sits in the high-end tier of home theater receivers, and the headline numbers 130 watts per channel into 8 ohms, 8K HDMI 2.1 support, Dolby Atmos and DTS X, plus Sony's own 360 spatial sound calibration make it sound like the kind of gear that should turn any modest TV setup into a small-scale cinema. The question is whether those specs translate into everyday convenience and real performance, or whether you end up juggling a maze of inputs, firmware quirks, and a price tag that could have bought a solid mid-range speaker system instead. Let's start with the HDMI side of things because that's usually the first deal-breaker for anyone building a 4K per 120Hz or 8K gaming rig. The STRAZ5000ES offers 7 HDMI inputs and 2 outputs, all wired for HDMI 2.1. In practice, that means you can run a next-gen console, a 4K Blu-ray player, a streaming box, and still have 2 HDMI throw passes for a projector or a secondary TV without constantly swapping cables. I tested it with a PlayStation 5 set to 4K per 120Hz, a Roku Ultra, and a 4K Blu-ray player. The handoff between sources was seamless, no signal blips, and the auto-switching remembered which device I'd last used for each input. The only hiccup I ran into was that the firmware didn't initially recognize the newer HDR10 Plus metadata from the Blu-ray, which required a quick update via Sony's website. Once that was done, HDR10 Plus, Dolby Vision, and HDR10 all displayed correctly, and the color grading was spot on. If you're a gamer who wants to keep the console's low-latency mode alive, the receiver's HDMI 2.1 support ensures you don't lose the 120Hz frame rate, something many older receivers can't guarantee. Audio calibration is where Sony tries to differentiate itself. The Digital Cinema Auto Calibration 9 uses a mic that can be placed on your front left speaker and then sweeps the room, measuring reflections and speaker placement to generate what Sony calls 360 spatial sound. In my living room, a medium-sized rectangle with a rug and a couple of bookshelves, I found the calibration fairly quick, about 3 minutes, and the resulting soundstage felt broader than the speakers would suggest on their own. Dialogue from a dialogue-heavy drama stayed clear even when the volume dipped during quieter scenes. That said, the calibration assumes a fairly symmetrical speaker layout. If your rear speakers are significantly farther away or you have a non-standard height for your front speakers, you'll need to manually tweak the distance settings afterward. The auto calibration is a great starting point, but it isn't a set-and-forget solution for every room shape. Now, the receiver's power rating of 130 watts per channel at 8 ohms is respectable, but the real-world impact depends on your speaker choice. Pair the STRAZ5000ES with efficient bookshelf speakers, and you'll get clean, dynamic volume even at the upper end of the scale. However, if you pair it with low-efficiency floor-standing towers that demand more than 100 watts to reach their sweet spot, you may start to notice a slight compression at the highest volumes. The THD, total harmonic distortion, is listed at 0.9% at 1 kHz, which is fine for most listening, but audiophiles who are chasing sub 0.1% might feel it's a step down from a dedicated audiophile amp. In day-to-day TV watching or streaming movies, that distortion level is inaudible, but if you plan to use the receiver as a primary music amp for high-resolution FLAC files, you may want to keep expectations in check. Connectivity beyond HDMI is another area where the STRAZ5000ES tries to be future-proof. Built-in Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and Chromecast let you stream Spotify, Pandora, or your personal library without a separate streamer. The Sonos integration is especially handy if you already own a Sonos ecosystem, you can designate the receiver as the home theater zone and control it through the Sonos app. In practice, the switch from a Sonos Beam to the STRAZ5000ES as the main sound source took just a few taps, and the app displayed real-time volume and input selection. One downside is that the Bluetooth latency is noticeable about 150 ms, so you won't want to use Bluetooth for gaming or watching movies. Stick to the wired HDMI or Wi-Fi options for sync-critical content. Who should actually consider buying this receiver? If you already have a 7.1 or 9.1 speaker system, are looking to upgrade to Atmos, and plan to run an 8K TV or a next-gen console at 120 Hz, the STRAZ5000ES checks most boxes. It's